Hello, my name is Jana Podina, and I'm a researcher from the University of Bucharest. And my goal today is to talk about socioeconomic decisions in depression and anxiety. Ahead of approaching this quite interesting topic, I would like to add that this is my very first podcast and definitely my first scientific podcast. Now, going back to our topic, why talk about decision making and psychopathology, and why talk about socioeconomic decision making? First of all, because it is a well known marker of depression and anxiety. So we know for quite some time that difficulty in making decisions is a core symptom of depression, for instance, yet we know very little about the nature of these difficulties. Then, second of all, approaching socioeconomic decision making would actually show the pragmatic side to a field that is usually investigated in the laboratory, meaning that we don't usually often talk about the fact that anxiety and depression have actual repercussions not only at the level of behavior and at the level of mood, of which we often talk about, but they actually have consequences at the level of your ability to think, your ability to make judgments. And this is a discussion that is quite essential. And most of all, if we are going to talk about socioeconomic decision making, we will talk about the fact that anxiety and depression actually also mark your expenses, they mark your gains, and most of all, they mark your monetary losses, which makes this discussion even more pragmatical and more day-to-day relevant. Now, another aspect and another facade pertaining to decision making is the fact that more and more research leads to the fact that this process is quite relevant for diagnosis. For instance, recent research leading up to this idea evidences that decision making tasks predict with a 72% accuracy the depression status. So, of course, this is only one of a few studies, but there are many more to come. Then another reason for which I believe that this topic is important to be discussed and is important to be approached is because it very much aligns with our current research priorities, that is the research domain criteria framework, which highlights the importance of investigating processes in psychopathology so as to further our knowledge regarding psychopathology. Now, moving on to the structure of the presentation, I believe that we're going to go for a linear development of unfolding of our discussion. So we're going to move on from talking about how decision making is made according to the norms of typical decision making in healthy individuals, up to how decision making looks like in depression and anxiety. And in between, of course, approach how specific emotions lead up to decision making, how they influence decision making. But in order to be able to follow this linear structure, we also need to remember a bit and talk a bit about the typical socioeconomic tasks that are usually used to investigate decision making. And we're talking about the ultimatum game, the dictator game, the impunity game, Iowa gambling task. I believe that these are all tasks that are very, very highly known and typically taught in undergraduate studies. So I'm not going to detail them. I'm going to detail especially the ultimatum game and the dictator game, which are two tasks that are highly investigated in regards to socioeconomic decision making. The ultimatum game is a task where player A has an amount of money. Player A, also known as the proposer, has an amount of money which he can share with player B, also called the responder, and where player B can accept or reject the offer made by player A. The twist to this story is the fact that if player B rejects the amount of money offered by player A, then he or she goes with nothing, but also does player A. So both of them leave with nothing in their pockets. Now, the dictator game has a very suggestive name, is a bit different. We also have a player A and player B, but here player A decides, once he or she decides to share the amount of money that he or she has, player B can only accept the amount of money given. So There is no accepting and there is no rejecting, only accepting, so hence the name dictator game. We also have the impunity game, which is a twist to these two, a twist less investigated because of its recency in socioeconomic decision making in psychopathology. And this game looks in the following manner. Player A shares an amount of money with player B, and player B can, of course, accept the amount of money or can reject. But unlike the ultimatum game, if player B rejects, he or she goes with nothing. However, player A goes with the amount of money that he or she was set to keep. So here the only person that loses is player B, if he or she decides to do so. Now, how do decisions look according to the norm? The majority of the proposers in the ultimatum game choose to offer around 40% of their amount. So this is what healthy individuals use, and this is what the norm does. Then, in the dictator game, things look a bit differently. That is, the proposers choose to offer only around 26% of their amount. So they're actually being very dictatorish. Now, in regards to the responders, the majority of the responders tend to reject offers that are less than 20% of the endowment. Now, this is a response according to the norm, but not necessarily a rational response according to behavioral economics, since it would make sense and it would be reasonable and rational to actually accept the amount of money that you're offered because it's more than you tend to have in the present. So, in essence, individuals tend to quite uniformly reciprocate good deeds, reject unfair proposals, and try to enforce obedience to social rules and norms in non-cooperative individuals. So this is the main trend according to the norm. Now, going forward to our discussion regarding specific emotions and decision making. So leaving aside a bit the emotion side and keeping only the arousal nature of the emotions, we have a lot of interesting papers on this thematic. One of the most well-known is Ariely's papers from 2005 entitled The Heat of the Moment, the Effect of Sexual Arousal on Sexual Decision-Making. And this paper emphasizes the fact that when we are in a cool state, we rarely tend to be accurate about how our behavior is going to be in a hot state. So our decision making very much depends from one moment to another, and most importantly, from one state of arousal to another. Now, going back to emotions, and to specific emotions in particular, we're going to discuss a bit how the results look like in the ultimatum game task, for instance, and outside the ultimatum game. In the ultimatum game, take for instance sadness, which is the proxiest emotion we have to depression. Sadness seems to be associated with higher rejection rate of unfair offers, which is sort of intuitive. Guilt, on the other hand, leads to making higher offers as a proposer, and anger leads to rejection of unfair offers. Outside the ultimatum game, we have results such as sadness reduces selling prices of an object for sellers and increases buying prices for buyers. Sadness also makes participants choose less money immediately rather than waiting 3 months for a bigger sum, so there is a bit of an issue with delayed gratification. And, of course, sadness favors seeking immediate rewards. Both results make sense together. Anxiety, on the other hand, favors the tendency to reduce uncertainty, which is also a behavior that is found not only in specific anxiety, but also in anxiety disorders. Now, on the fun fact and let's say fun fact side of this story, we also have research which highlights that economists, for instance, found correlations between sunny days and stock market performance in 26 countries. Of course, this is not necessarily a result pinpointing to specific emotions, but it's yet interesting to see that in 26 countries, so in an intercultural study, we can find an interesting correlation between Sunny days, of course, our mood and our behavior on the stock market, how risky we are in that day. Now, going actually forward, I keep saying going forward to decision making and depression and anxiety, we obviously have to enter the field of abnormal decision making. And of course, we're going to begin with depression, which I entitled it Chapter 1, and anxiety will be, of course, Chapter 2. Now, here we are going to talk about some interesting studies. There are studies which show that more depressive symptoms lead to decisions that are less likely to further one's interest. So that means that the more depressed you are, the less likely you are to make decisions that will further your own interest. Similarly, the reward learning, which we know from prior research is quite effective in depressed individuals, is slower in depressed individuals in ultimatum gain tasks and not only. So they don't really tend to learn from rewards. As well as their willingness to wait for reward is impacted. So again, this very much makes sense as we know that their reward learning system is very much impacted by depression. Then again, we also have results which evidence that depressed individuals are more likely to regret their decisions once made, which only augments the turmoil that they're going through. Depressed individuals also tend to predict future outcomes in a more pessimistic manner, and of course this is something to be expected, and often withdraw effort as they often consider that the reward is not worth it. They also tend to be indecisive and have a diminished ability to concentrate, which is also according to the APA manual. Now, we spoke about here about how depression looks like and how altered decision making look like in depressed individuals outside socioeconomic decision making. Now, how do they look like inside tasks such as the ultimatum game and the dictator game? We see that when, for instance, majorly depressed individuals act as proposers, they tend to propose more fair offers, which is quite an interesting result that depressed individuals are more fair towards their player B counterparts. When they act as responders, they tend to reject offers, no matter if they are unfair, fair, and altruistic. They tend to reject more so than healthy individuals. And of course, they reject the most unfair offers. That's a result that keeps appearing in the literature in comparison to healthy individuals. As an emotional response, how depressed individuals feel while playing the game, they seem to react more negatively when receiving unfair offers, more so than their healthy counterparts. And there is also an interesting result from Robson et al. From 2018, which evidences that they also experience a bit more happiness about fair offers than their healthy counterparts. And this is definitely a subject to be discussed and a bit counterintuitive, since we imagine majorly depressed individuals to be anhedonic about everything. So this is quite an interesting result to discuss. And why not for you to approach this study in detail. Now, how do things look like in the dictator game? We only have results with majorly depressed individuals as proposers and not as responders, but we can see that in the dictator game, there are not that much differences in between depressed individuals and healthy individuals, which makes the ultimatum game more of an attuned and fine-tuned instrument to actually make a discrepancy between depressed individuals and healthy individuals. Now the first question of the lecture. Do you believe that some of the socioeconomic decision-making particularities presented here are manifestation of depression, or could depression be a result of multiple self-detrimental decisions?
Now, in answering it, keep in mind that depression often results in self-detrimental decisions. And also keep in mind the results of the following study, which took data from a national survey and a subsequent follow-up and led to the following results. That is, individuals that decided to provide a monthly financial support of $10 or more per month had a significant development of major depression in comparison to those who did not provide a financial support. So, what is your opinion?
In regards to our own research on depression and socioeconomic decision making, I would like to present the following study, which is based on some preliminary results. Here I would like to introduce Denisa Kakolidis, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Bucharest. Her research is entitled "The More I Get, the Less I Want: An Empirical Investigation of Rejection Sensitivity and Guilt in Depression." So therefore, this research will be very much of depression's interconnection with guilt, which is very much known from the literature. In a healthy individual, for instance, guilt can act as a moral compass, leading to a cooperating and making amends situation. However, in depressed individuals, guilt particularly emerges as a somewhat pervasive and misplaced responsibility, somewhat of disillusional proportions. Now, paradoxically, it appears in both contexts of reward and when some form of wrongdoing or unfairness is geared towards a depressed person. So, therefore, a depressed person cannot escape guilt. However, will it be present in socioeconomic transactions when there is no social pressure element or any element of social interaction whatsoever, such as the ultimatum gain? And if it will be present, why? We have very little literature on mechanisms underlying socioeconomic decision making, so we are aiming a bit for one. The current study aims to investigate particularly the emotional response of guilt in depression in negative exchanges, that is, when the participants receive unfair offers. We expect that in negative encounters, receiving unfair offers and rejecting them would cause harm to the other player, and therefore experiencing guilt should be justifiable in corroboration to depression. Now, in addition to this, I would also like to introduce another variable that is very much linked to guilt, which is rejection sensitivity. Rejection sensitivity is an important path to guilt in social situations as it stems out of a hyped fear of being rejected in typical and depressed individuals. Yet, depressed individuals tend to have a high rejection sensitivity threshold. Therefore, we hypothesize that rejection sensitivity would be an important mediator in the depression-guilt relationship in the ultimatum gain task, even though this is not your typical social interaction. And we base this on a study from 2019, where in situations with no potential risk of being rejected, that is, completely harm-absent conditions, participants with high rejection sensitivity still experience more guilt. We add a bit of a twist to our mediation model and complicate it a bit with a moderated mediation model. That is, we expect that rejection sensitivity would mediate the relationship between depressive symptoms and guilt, especially at high rates of rejection of offers. So this we have to keep in mind. Similarly, we expect that when the received offer is perceived as highly unfair, the mediation model will no longer be significant and there will be no reason for a path from rejection sensitivity to guilt. Basically, there will be no reason to feel guilt or to be rejection sensitive. How did we pursue this study? We did it in the following manner. We chose a sample of participants and assessed their depression levels based on the BDI, so the participants were not pre-selected based on their depression scores. So this is an important aspect, though we are constantly referring to depression.
Then our selected participants went through the ultimatum gain task. It's a standard ultimatum gain task where most of the trials were unfair trials. That is, the participant received less than 30% of the split. After the unfair trials, the participants were given a rating of how much fairness did they perceive that their split offer was. So these are some elements that need to be known about the study, in addition to the fact that after these trials, we also asked the participants how their shame, what is the level of shame and guilt that they expressed. Now, an important aspect also to be mentioned is the fact that rejection sensitivity was not state measured, it was trait measured. What are our results, the main results I would say? First of all, we did get an important association between depression and guilt, which is very much in line with the literature. So the more experienced depression, the more guilt. Unfair offers tended to be mostly rejected. We talk about an 86% rejection rate, thus causing harm to the unfair player by punishing him for his proposals. As hypothesized, rejection sensitivity mediated the relationship between depressive symptoms and guilt, and this effect tended to be stronger, especially at higher rates of rejection of offers. This mediated moderation model explained for 51% of guilt, which is quite important. Then, also in accordance with our predictions, there is another twist, another moderation twist to our mediation element. That is, interestingly, the indirect effect of depression on guilt through rejection sensitivity was not significant when the offers were perceived as highly unfair. Therefore, there was no reason to be rejection sensitive and no reason to experience guilt. Towards the end of this presentation of the study, I would like to highlight the following. So yes, as hypothesized, rejection sensitivity mediated the relationship between depressive symptoms and guilt, and this result to some extent gives us an insight into why depressed individuals may be more guilty in social exchanges. Of course, why is a very generous term. Also, hypothetically, though it remains to be proven, participants not only felt guilty for causing harm, but were also afraid that their transgression will be judged by their peers and the consequences may be social exclusion. This peer then may have turned into guilt, but of course, this is only hypothetically, it was not necessarily investigated here. Now, going back to what was investigated here, while other mechanisms may be at play as well in the relationship between depression and guilt, rejection sensitivity is definitely worthy of attention, the moderated mediated model explained. These results should inform future studies on the potential explanatory factors that lead to guilt in depression and in what type of situations these feelings occur. Furthermore, it draws attention to the importance of perception of fairness and how it can justify certain behaviors that bypass guilt. There are some limitations to this study which are worthy of your attention, and that is the fact that the testing of the indirect effect in mediation is better suited for higher samples, especially since we did a mediated moderation model. Then a mediator should have definitely been experimentally manipulated, not to mention that rejection sensitivity would have been ideally measured state-like and not trait-like. And finally, what a future study should add to the table is the fact that they should definitely include clinical samples, as we were not able to do that. Now, going back to what other mechanisms might be at stake in the depression and guilt relationship, I'm curious to see your opinions, hence I have an additional question for you. Topic of anxiety, which as opposed to depression is less abundant in research, so therefore there's a lot of gap to fill in terms of findings. However, there are some studies. For instance, a study from 2012 indicates that anxious patients, and here we talk about anxieties of various forms, tend to accept significantly more unfair offers as opposed to their healthy peers.
We, specifically in a research of our own, obtained different results. However, our research was on socially anxious individuals, so different mechanisms might be at play. With regard to socially anxious individuals, literature says that they tend to be less generous overall, even when they tend to play with simulated friends. In regards to generalized anxiety disorders, GAD individuals tend to accept more unfair offers as responders in the ultimatum game, and in regards to their emotional response to the offers, they tend to have the same emotional response to fair and unfair offers. In regards to fairness, they report unfair offers as less unequal than healthy peers do. Individuals high on trait anxiety tend to respond a bit differently. They generally, when they're proposers, they generally make fair offers. When they're responders, they generally accept unfair offers, which according to the literature coincides with their low esteem. As an emotional response, they tend to be more negative, to provide more negative emotional responses in regards to fair and unfair offers, similar to generalized anxiety disorder individuals. Here we propose the following: an alternative mechanism by which social anxiety can affect interpersonal relationships, and this is vindictiveness. Now, vindictiveness in regards to social anxiety isn't necessarily a new concept, yet it is a new concept in regard to socioeconomic decision making. We argue here that vindictiveness is related to social rank in socially anxious individuals who tend to view interactions in hierarchical terms rather than affiliative terms. So they are definitely concerned with the dominance-inferiority balance. We also argue here that personal gain comes actually second to punishment in socially anxious individuals. Hence, we expect that in the ultimatum gain task, socially anxious individuals will tend to overall reject unfair proposals in comparisons to their peers, to their healthy peers, for instance. Therefore, they will be more punitive as reflected in their rejection rate as well as their self-reported fairness ratings. How did we investigate this question? First of all, we selected our participants based on their social anxiety levels, based on the Leibovitz social anxiety scale. We used a cutoff score of 60 and above to be a bit more restrictive. Then we also looked at the depression level so that we do not have a contamination with depression. So we selected individuals in the social anxiety group, individuals that were not high on depression. In the end, we ended up with 3 groups. One was of healthy individuals with no depressive or socially anxious traits. One was of socially anxious individuals but with no depressive traits. And the third was of individuals with both social anxiety and high depression traits, so as to isolate the potential effect that depression could have on our results, being a known comorbid issue of social anxiety. We also used the ultimatum game task for this purpose, and it's a standard ultimatum game task which is very much similar to what I described at the beginning of this presentation, so I will not go through it. However, I will add that at the end of each trial, at the end of each proposed split, our participants had a fairness rating where they could obviously rate how fair was the split in their opinion. Now, how do the results look like? In terms of acceptance rate, we can see the following. We can see that all groups tended to accept fair offers, so there is no difference here. However, in regards to unfair splits, we have high discrepancies in between social anxiety and healthy controls, meaning that socially anxious individuals tended to reject unfair splits more so than healthy individuals. That didn't happen in regards to social anxiety plus depression, so there is no difference here in between socially anxious individuals and social anxiety plus depression. Now, another interesting result which came about in regards to perceived ratings and which we would call somewhat paradoxical yet explainable is the fact that though they tended to reject unfair offers more than their peers, socially anxious individuals tended to rate higher on the perceived fairness. So they actually perceived the offers as more fair than their peers, than their healthy peers. So that's a bit paradoxical. On one end, they reject the offer, on the other, they perceive it as fair. So we believe here that their social agreeableness factor kicked in. Now, let's discuss a bit these results and, of course, the limitations and future directions that should be done in regards to this research. So, coming back to vindictiveness, we believe that vindictiveness is an important driver of economic decision making and social anxiety in socially anxious participants, and that our participants were evidently punitive when they were offered the chance to do so. Now, these results broadly align with the social rank perspective in social anxiety, which I presented previously, and they also align with the fact that instead of avoiding confrontation and adopting a submissive position, our participants, our socially anxious participants, acting according to their mindset, that is, to reject unfair offers. So we believe that their behavior in the ultimatum game was rather driven by social ranks, by a social rank system, and financial maximization was definitely a secondary goal for them. Now, there are several limitations to our interpretation and to this research. First of all, though we did use a high cutoff score for social anxiety and though we did isolate comorbidities, a replication is needed, and definitely a study on clinical samples will be needed. Then, our interpretation of social rank remains an interpretation, and definitely there are other interpretations out there of our results. Also, we did hypothesize that vindictiveness is an important marker and they're punitive in regards to their social transactions. However, we did not ask our socially anxious participants what was the reasoning behind their rejection of unfair offers. So definitely, if a new study is going to be done on this direction, we would suggest adding this important question so we actually know the reasoning behind making the decision. So having all this added to a future research will definitely be a plus. So, given that I said that this is one of the possible, the social rank perspective in social anxiety is definitely one of the possible interpretations. I'm curious to see how you view these results and what's your interpretation of them in the following question. Now, after discussing extensively about decision making in anxiety and depression, perhaps you are wondering how does decision making look like in other pathologies. We do not have much literature to debate upon. However, I was able to find a few studies that regard other forms of pathology. For instance, individuals that tend to consume alcohol on a daily basis tend to be as responders in the ultimatum game tend to be accepting fewer unfair and altruistic offers, while as proposers they tend to have similar results to controls. In regards to schizophrenia, when they are in the role of the proposer, they tend to propose more money, they tend to make more fair and altruistic offers, and when they act as responders, they tend to reject more fair and altruistic offers and accept more unfair offers. Borderline individuals, we do not have results as proposers. However, as responders, borderline individuals tend to accept more offers per se. Autism sufferers, as proposers, tend to have results again similar to controls in the ultimatum game. However, as responders, they tend to accept more unfair offers and reject more fair offers. Now, keep in mind when viewing and interpreting these results, and of course, take these results with a pinch of salt, as
we do not have replications of any of these studies. Now, I would like to go back a bit to our discussion in regards to depression and anxiety, which is a discussion dear to me. That is, what are the mechanisms underlying all the results that you have seen before? Because we have enlisted several interesting results, yet we do not know necessarily the mechanisms involved. There are several mechanisms that I was able to extract from the literature, especially from the cognitive literature, that could potentially explain some of these results, but of course we need much more. So one such explanation could be the fact that we know that both anxious individuals and depressed individuals tend to have an altered belief system that is obviously miscalibrated by affect, and that is expected to play a critical role in how depressed and anxious individuals make decisions. Imagine, for instance, having an unworthiness schema, how this would definitely impact your negotiation skills, for instance. So this can definitely lead to a misrepresentation of the costs and rewards when selecting a course of action in the ultimatum game and, of course, in real life. Now, aside from an altered belief system, a lowered motivational drive, especially in depressed individuals, but not only, is also expected to lead to a different course of action as opposed to healthy individuals. I expect that a lower motivational drive would still be led by altered beliefs and expectations, and this would impact how depressed and anxious individuals initiate a course of action and pursue a reward. And in this respect, I have a relatively recent paper from 2014, which highlights some quite interesting results in regards to the motivational drive of depressed individuals. They found evidence that there is of course, decreased willingness to make efforts for rewards among individuals with subsyndromal symptoms of depression. The effect was amplified in major depression disorder, and the effect, interestingly, dissipated in remitted depressed individuals. So this evidently connects what we already know, that is that depressed individuals don't tend to pursue reward. And now we know why, because they do have motivational deficits. And we know that these motivational deficits are highly connected to their characteristic anhedonia. And interestingly, this very much correlates with their degree of impairment. So the motivational drive could be another potential explanatory mechanism. Then there's also a heightened threat avoidance that is present in both depression and anxiety, and an increased bias towards threat that characterizes both pathologies. Now, taking for instance only the example of anxiety, we know from the literature that generalized anxiety disorder individuals tend to avoid decisions with high gain and long-term losses. But more importantly than this, they tend to learn to avoid decisions with high immediate gain and high long-term losses, significantly faster than comparison subjects. So this heightened threat avoidance and this increased bias that they tend to have not only affects their decision making, but also how fast they learn to make certain decisions. Now, there are also other mechanisms at stake, such as intolerance of uncertainty in anxious individuals, which obviously impairs their reward perception and, of course, their delayed gratification. Then there's also an attenuated processing of reward that we have already spoke about in depression, and an increased negative evaluation of the self, which is also present in depression. Here we are also talking about the unworthiness schema. Overall, we can talk, for instance, about an increased sensitivity to losses and punishments, or sensitivity in depression. Again, in regards to how fast they learn to make certain decisions, depressed individuals learn to make decisions, especially faster based on punishment than on rewards. And unlike them, anxious individuals tend to have enhanced risk aversion, but not necessarily an enhanced loss aversion, which I find it to be quite an interesting result. Now, we can reference a whole body of literature stemming from the cognitive side and the emotional side, and not only to explain some of the above mentioned findings throughout this presentation. However, I do believe that more mechanistic research is needed in regard to socioeconomic decision making, especially at the intersection with psychopathology, which is the topic that we're discussing today. Now, I also want to leave you with a message for you as an audience, as a reader of this presentation, which stems, of course, from science, from the science that we mentioned above, and which stems with the following. Avoid making decisions in a highly emotional state. We know this for quite some time. Be aware of your anxious and trait depressive tendencies and what their known influence on decision making is according to science, because awareness to some extent helps you make better decisions. Keep in mind when you plan that according to science, the decisions we make in a non-emotional state are very different from the decisions we make in an emotional state. And here I reference the Ariely study. And most importantly, get out of your perspective, and why not ask for a second opinion. And if financial decisions are at stake, ask for an expert opinion, as we know that there is a plethora of factors, of emotional and trait-like factors that influence our trait-like decision making. Now, what are the scientific hurdles of this field? There are many to mention, but I will mention only some of the ones I mentioned before, so I can further emphasize them. So most of what we know regarding socioeconomic decision making is derived from lab studies and not real life transactions. So we can only make some estimates of real life responses with some degree of cautiousness. And this degree of cautiousness can be so well exemplified, for instance, by the social anxiety studies and the ultimatum game, for instance. I mean, in the ultimatum game and any other type of dictator game and any other type of lab-like task, we can see that there's a degree of artificiality in the interaction element. And we know that socially anxious individuals tend to have impairments in decision making, especially in social situations. So when you are interacting with another player which you cannot see and with whom you don't necessarily interact face to face, you're expecting a certain degree of artificiality in socially anxious individuals' responses. So this is definitely an example of the fact that some lab studies do have a degree of artificiality and they need more ecological relevance. So there is a definite need for more ecological studies. There is also a need for a common theoretical framework to embrace results from this now emerging interdisciplinary line of research that merges both clinical sciences and behavioral economics, and we do not have this yet. Not to mention, coming back to this topic, that we need more investigations, more research on the hypothesized. Now that the presentation has come to an end, I would also like to thank you for your time and patience to view this video. And I would like to extend a thank you to my colleagues Christoph Lückinger and Andrea Abwissler from the University of Zurich. I especially thank them for inviting me to hold this lecture in front of you. If you have questions, curiosities, don't forget that we can make this lecture a bit more interactive by you accessing the YouTube channel and leaving some comments there. So thank you again for your time.